Welcome to the Intrazone, a show about the Microsoft 365 Intelligent Intranet. I'm Mark Cashman, here with my co-host Chris, the guy who loves to talk about Viva, McNulty.
Well, thanks, Mark. So today's episode, we're not going to be talking about an intelligent intranet, or at least not directly. We're going to be sitting down with Martin Woodward from our GitHub organization and Tetsuya Kawahara, a Microsoft MVP, about how the developer community comes together to work and benefit from shared problems to emerging technologies, and how the community rallies around using GitHub and everything that's out there in our community.
You know, one of the things that I learned just talking with Martin and Tetsuya was the value of not just the act of sharing, but the value of what you get back from sharing. And I think what really drove the conversation, and to be honest, I think 5 years ago would have been a harder conversation to have for Microsoft, was this value of open source, putting your code out there, putting your thoughts out there from a developer's perspective, and getting feedback from it, or at least asking for people for feedback. You know, how nice would it be to have whatever it is that you're working on reviewed by others that you hold in high esteem, or have great feedback in terms of, well, I might do this or that differently. But to do that, again, with that open source motion, 5 years ago, and this is where I want to kind of ask my first question to you, Chris. When you think of Microsoft 5 and plus years ago, and you say open source, what image comes to mind?
5 years ago I might have a slightly different answer, but 10 years ago, there was a lot of hostility. You ask me Microsoft open source 10 years ago, I mentally am depicting a bank vault in my head, like someone slamming it closed and sealing it up. Because the idea, why would you share your designs, share your thoughts, share your IP, as wrapped up in code, and put it out there for the world to see? I remember seeing a presenter saying, it would be like a bank publishing their architecture, floor plans, and vault design on a big billboard outside of the bank. Why would I? And the answer is, in the long run, if you're thinking out loud like that, then other people can also contribute and say, hey, did you, realize that there's a creek running under the bank and it might be not great for the foundation, but if you were to rerun it this way, everything would be fine. And that thinking out loud, I think, has been a real sea change for Microsoft. I mean, Mark, you were at the Future of SharePoint event, which was 5 years ago, where we were really leaning into, as we still are, SharePoint framework and, open source toolkits. And, at the time, Angular, React, and Knockout were, coming to the forefront for how Microsoft develops code, how we encouraged our customers to develop code, and to plug in these non-Microsoft toolkits. Well, it certainly felt fresh at the time.
It did. It felt very fresh. And I remember just not being a developer, but seeing the kind of thought leadership and concern that went into just even raising that flag of the direction that we were going. So the SharePoint framework, very new, and really trying to leverage a broader set of a developer community. There are the SharePoint developers, and I know that, the team used to refer to you need a SharePoint PhD to be able to create a solution in SharePoint. But with this turn of the SharePoint framework, all of those tools you just listed, I remember one that just always caught my attention by the name, Gulp. I don't even know quite what it is, but just that fact that it's a common tool that a broader set of web developers are using truly meant that we were going to open up to a broader set of the community that had a lot of experience building really unique experiences, performant experiences, secure experiences, just new and inviting experiences for the web. And that was the direction that SharePoint was going, so that it could be more inviting, more secure, more open in the context of, that shared responsibility of what direction is SharePoint going. Off of that, and it may be not exactly timed with the specific event, 5 years ago, the future of SharePoint. But I think the future of SharePoint, from how our team was promoting and getting back from the community, was their notion of sharing is caring. And I think that's a really great notion for being accepting of others, but also in the context of sharing code, learning from others, working on, on behalf of or on top of what other people have done to carry forward and just make that space a better place. I think the framework took a while to grow up. It took a lot, to get people more interested in SharePoint that were never SharePoint developers. Having known that that was a decision, and before that, the rigidity that you mentioned, and to now look back on it, it was the right move. And with the acquisition of GitHub and even Xamarin as one example, any reflections on, the state that we're in now before we learn from Martin and Tetsuya and in their realities of GitHub, but this motion of Microsoft to go this direction, where do you see that now? Is that a good decision and some of the benefits that you see?
Yeah, I mean, if it's really what we now talk about is edge computing, if you think about it. And we've been saying that enough over the last 3 years that it's important to go back to those first principles and saying, that the same way that we believe a diverse ecosystem of partners is kind of the most robust way of doing things, the same way that like a diverse biological ecosystem is much more resilient and adaptive and flexible. The more computing that you can throw at a given problem and coming at it from different approaches, you're generating that robust approach. And like assuming that, go back to the days of the Jetsons, the giant supercomputers that like all the data goes in and it does all the thinking and it does all the referencing and it does all of the sending answers back to you. That's actually really hard. There's a lot of innovation that's happened, but we haven't broken down the speed of light yet. And so the more that you can balance that and say, at that central computing level, like I don't need to figure out all the different possible ways that my results are going to get painted onto someone's screen. I'm going to create core services and let people have flexibility, let developers have flexibility, let devices have flexibility. And the nice thing about open source with all of that and kind of getting into that tradition of contributing and so forth is twofold. First, you don't just have more computers working on the problem, you have more developers and you have more programmers working on something. And people may spot, something in how, I'm iterating through an array and, what I'm doing to each of the elements there to say, hey, you can do it twice as fast if you do it this way. And then they publish that solution. And if you think about that, it's not just an impact on computing, but again, on the community.
I was just going to say, I really like that perspective, and I think it actually ties in with what you originally said with the kind of the bank example. If there were a heist movie and, like you said, maybe a stream was going underneath the bank, that's one attack vector that certainly would be important to know. How can we, stop the heist from happening from underneath because they took a boat and just got us in our weak spot? And if you get a lot of different perspectives and you get a lot of people working on closing some of those gaps or enhancing some of the experiences, and that comes from the community, that then they all benefit. It's not just everybody works for the one goal, but everybody benefits from it because they then can use it in their own solutions. I think it's a great perspective.
It also raises the bar on sloppy code, frankly. I can certainly say back in the days when I was coding, there was a lot more sloppy code, certainly that I helped. And because you'd write something, you'd compile it, and 50-50, no one's ever going to look at your code again. Having to think out loud and kind of learn from others, the fact that other people can watch what I'm doing, I think does kind of shift the mindset to being like, what does ready to release truly mean? And I think it, improves the code quality. Going back to the bank example, like if I were the architect, I'd be pretty ashamed to have, if I had designed the Death Star and I had a big port wide open, unprotected, just shoot anything down here and the whole thing blows up. I kind of, if I was forced to publish those plans officially, I might rethink everything I was doing before I published those.
If we take this notion of the community coming together and making it better, maybe as everybody listens to this episode, consider if you've written code or if you within a company, would consider like, what would it mean to open source, at least some of the methodology or the patterns and practices to connect with the community and potentially get that benefit back. I think you'll hear it from a platform perspective when we talk with Martin. I think you'll hear it from a real community member who is giving back and getting a lot of feedback. The how and certainly the what. I think it's real interesting when you hear what Tetsuya has produced and some of the ways that he gets value from the community.
That's why I'm even more excited to hear from Tetsuya, not just from a perspective of what does GitHub do, but like, what have people done with GitHub and the value there? I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that.
One note that Chris and I want to share is when we do talk with Tetsuya, he is Japanese, and you will hear a translation of what he said to us in terms of his response. But we will have at the end of the episode a full Q&A in his native language. So if you do speak Japanese and want to hear his full response in his native language, please stay till the end or jump to the end, and you can hear that full episode. My questions will be in English, but his full response at the end of the episode will be in Japanese. But I think with that, Chris, let's take this up and first meet in and hear from Martin Woodward. All right, it is now that time where we actually get to hear from the real smarts behind the scenes, behind the GitHub, the man, the myth, the legend, Martin Woodward. Welcome to the Intrazone.
Wow, what an introduction. Thanks, Mark.
So we want to get behind the myth and the legend, and you can tell me if that's overselling or underselling. From your own words, would love to hear about your positions at Microsoft, what you do now at GitHub, anything else that rounds out the who is Martin.
Wow, well, thanks very much. So, yeah, I'm Martin Woodward. I'm Director of Developer Relations here at GitHub now. Previously, I had a real job. I was working in banks and insurance companies and all that sort of stuff, delivering IT, different sort of sets of jobs. So I did some SharePoint consultancy back in the day, did some, IIS stuff, did some AAD stuff, whatever it took, whatever the client needed. That's what I did because I was an SI consultant. So had a real job. Then I did a startup in 2004 with a few friends. We were building the Java and cross-platform tooling for what became Team Foundation Server. So we were doing that. And in that role, that was where I was around the Microsoft community, but that's kind of where I got more and more involved in the Microsoft community and actually became an MVP. And so I was an MVP for a few years. And then became, our company got acquired in November 2009. So joined Microsoft then. And then, I've been around. So I was doing a lot of open source, working on TFS and things like that. Worked on Coplex for a while. I was sort of looked after Coplex, and then I was actually the one that created the GitHub account for Microsoft. That was, and sort of handled that whole move over to GitHub for Microsoft's open source strategy. And introduced Git into the company, did a bunch of Git stuff, went and set up the .NET Foundation with a bunch of friends over there. So worked on a .NET team for a little bit with a lot of folks, and then came back to what became Azure DevOps and came over and was part of the acquisition team for GitHub, and then moved over to GitHub in the summer of last year. So I've been around here and sort of getting to know the GitHub side since the acquisition, and working with the community there. And I spend most of my days now sort of talking to open source community members and helping developers sort of get the most out of GitHub kind of thing, and helping them do the whole DevOps sort of chain, as well as spending a lot of time in open source communities and working with open source people.
Well, I think the myth is no longer obfuscated. We've got some details. One of the real strengths of the community and GitHub in support of the community is the sharing of what it is that you've done, written code, best practices, and would love to get into all of that as far as the real goals of GitHub. But to hear that you have really brought Microsoft along, and I don't want to overload that by saying you and you only, but I think, it does take a few individuals that really believe in the value of open source, having Microsoft be such a large player in the tech space. If we weren't contributing in any fashion or significantly, I think is really the footprint that we're now establishing, then I don't know what that would look like in a today world where we aren't sharing.
Exactly. I mean, if you look back to where we were sort of 10 years ago and where Microsoft was 10 years ago, and wasn't really part of, there was two things. One, it wasn't really part of the conversation. And so for a lot of, sysadmins and for a lot of sort of developers, it wasn't that it's the old generation. The newer generation didn't hate Microsoft. It wasn't really relevant to them. It wasn't part of their lives. And because the Microsoft community was in its own spaces, it wasn't really interoperating with the rest of the tech community much, and it was kind of in its own silos. And so it was a very, very deliberate decision when we kind of moved Microsoft ourselves into GitHub. Well, it was very deliberately, so not just Microsoft was more visible to the rest of the open source world, but that the community that goes with Microsoft and goes along with Microsoft kind of thing, the whole rest of the world would be exposed to this massive, awesome, vibrant community that is the Microsoft community. Like, oh, heck, these folks are doing a lot of stuff here, and there's a lot of them, and they're doing cool things. And that community was just invisible to the other part of the community up until this point. So hopefully the visibility of everybody's works increased, and there's a lot more kind of cross-pollination of ideas, across the whole of technology now, which I think we're definitely seeing, especially with things like Windows Subsystem for Linux and all that sort of stuff. We're seeing this cross-pollination a lot more now. And that's just great. Like, we're all learning from each other and we're all sharing. And so that's all goodness. If you finish the day smarter than you started the day, then it's been a good day, hasn't it?
That's a great way to put it. But I think there was the notion of, from a Microsoft perspective, gosh, are we going to really share our IP? Are we going to share code, that is unique and of worth to us? But I think what we missed or weren't really engaging in was the breadth of developers that we could really work with and, have it be a coexistence of not only us sharing, but them, providing feedback, building on top of, making better. And even to hear, and I certainly work a lot with the SharePoint team and engineering, and that under Jeff Teeper, he has now for a while been very open about saying, and I think one of his vice presidents, Omar Shaheen, supports this as well, is if we don't need to build it, or if there's really great code out there that we can leverage, as long as it's viable and all the rights and copy whatnot, do it. We should do that and contribute back in support of just making it better or having it better reviewed or more reviewed, whatever that takes. I have seen a big change like you articulated, and I think it really opens up to, you don't have to have a narrow view on how you approach developing on our platforms, and it really broadens out different tools and people. That change has been significant. And I'll cap it off with just, if you didn't see the tweets or the social mentions a ways back, there were a lot of, I think cows are now flying every time there was some notion of Microsoft doing anything with the open source community. Kind
of shows some of the culture change that happened both in Microsoft and kind of the Microsoft community, in that it became a lot more of a learning culture, a learn-it-all culture rather than a know-it-all culture. It's a lot more about, like, what can we do, what can we learn, what can we share, how can we learn from others, rather than assuming the smartest people are the ones in the room, assuming that there are people out there smarter than you and going speaking to them and what can you do, what can you learn from them. And I think that's probably the biggest culture change that happened at Microsoft over the past 10 years was becoming a very learn-it-all culture. And then things like the open source sort of elements fed into that, and it was really interesting on the inside as well, seeing how, as Microsoft got more and more familiar with open source, actually how that changed how Microsoft worked internally and became a lot more kind of what we call inner source, but, using open source style practices inside the company to share and collaborate. And it's been a fascinating journey over the past, 10 years. I've been one of the few people to be a part of it kind of thing. And it's been a big team driving all this, and it's been a fascinating journey to be a part of, and definitely one of those changes in the industry that it's just a privilege to witness,
So if we can just talk first about the primary goals, as simple as you might put it, are what are the values of GitHub, how you and your team build the platform with open ears, obviously with what our community needs. But what is that kind of initial primary benefits of GitHub?
we want GitHub to be where the world builds software, where the world comes together to build solutions. And that means everything. So it's the home for developers, and you already know of it like as the home of open source development. And that's what most people get exposed to GitHub initially. But it's a home for all development to happen and where we want the collaboration place to be. So whether that's sharing of code and sharing of, libraries, that's one place where you collaborate and you come together. But there's also having discussions about functionality, about feature sets, tracking work, doing your build automations, doing your CI, your CD, all that sort of thing. And so really what it is it's a collaboration platform where there's 65 million participants in this massive community. There's over 200 million repositories like on GitHub, and I think it's like this massive community where everybody's there, everybody can share, can collaborate, can trade ideas, and you can also use that same platform to build software not just in public and not just sharing libraries, but also use that same platform to build and develop the software for your company and be able to do all the builds, deployments, everything you want to do like that for your company, as well as sharing things with the wider world. So that's it at its core.
Yeah, you had mentioned that you worked on and were a part of the TFS, the Team Foundation Server. The notion of working with inside the enterprise to be more collaborative, easy to share, but to take that at the scale you just mentioned across 65 million users, 200 million repositories, and however many lines of code that would equate to, which is going to be a lot. The notion of collaboration for developers is probably not new at a small, you work on my team, we report and work on the same project, but to expand that where I know the notions of open source is really to embrace that. But when people really start to leverage and contribute to GitHub and pull from GitHub, do you see the challenges where the scale is now of the platform? Just to maybe take a peek behind the scenes of when you see this significant metrics. What does that mean to the platform and how you design it or even manage and maintain it?
Yeah, it's certainly a whole different scale, because obviously TFS was around, and that was a good platform and a great solution for what it was. But and what it still is, it's still a growing platform. It was very much in the Microsoft niche, the Microsoft world, and again, wasn't a community that was kind of sharing things out there. So I built the cross-platform tools for TFS. So that was like literally what I did as a developer for a good while. But no matter how many times you would talk to like the Java team or the Linux team or whatever and explain how TFS could be used for those sorts of things, they never really believed you. Whereas GitHub is where all the developers are. And so you do and the scale that it works at is just insane. So like I say, 65 million devs are on there. You do a feature that's a cool feature, but all of a sudden you have a wait list of hundreds of thousands of people wanting to give it a try. And so it's a whole different scale of how you've got to build things out. And then with communities as well, it's fascinating to see how that works. As an organization, you might think, it's just for developers. Like, okay, I would leave it to them, but I'm not going to gatekeep who's a developer. I'm not going to stop people from becoming what I think of as a developer. You're developing, if you're writing SQL scripts, if you're doing, SharePoint controls, if you're doing deployments of SharePoint, you are a developer. You're building software and you're collaborating to build software and provide value to your customers. For a lot of organizations, how you deploy your SharePoint controls or how you deploy two different environments, so how you do Terraform scripts, how you stand up environments, all that sort of stuff. Sharing that knowledge and that information amongst your internal team is like really important to you as an organization, because it's not like there's any private IP to your particular team inside. There is IP for your company there because you don't want to release things about your network or whatever. But there's not anything particularly private about your organization. So even if you're in a highly regulated industry or if you're in a bank and things like that, you wouldn't want people who are on the front office knowing what your fraud prevention algorithms were. So you'd keep that private, but you're fine with everybody in the company knowing how you deploy to a SharePoint site or how you deploy out to your production environments. And so this notion of sharing both internally as well as with the wider world is where you see network effects kick in. And I'll give you a great example of we had Azure Pipelines in the TFS world. So Azure Pipelines was like a build CI system. We actually took a lot of that infrastructure and brought it to GitHub after the acquisition, and then made it GitHubby. And I can explain what GitHubby means, but made it GitHubby, but brought it in, but roughly the same infrastructure, brought it into GitHub. And now all of a sudden, it's the biggest CI/CD system out there. TFS has been around for a lot longer, and yet there's like 2,000 integrations in the store. GitHub's been around a year. GitHub Actions has been around a year. There's over 8,500, I think it's 9,000 extensions and different integrations of different platforms already. And because you've got this network effect of everybody sharing in one platform. So it's fascinating to see.
It is the scale of it. I mean, any platform would be pleased with a little bit of growth, but to see the exponential growth means the strategy is right, and not just that Microsoft got it right.
That's amazing. We've grown over 10 million developers in the past year. What's going on? I didn't know there were that many.
Let's just reference everything as the GitHubby effect, I think is
the GitHubby effect. Well, there's also GitHubby design, so making things that are very simple and extensible. But GitHub's all about it's quite a Unix mindset, really, or a PowerShell mindset, where it's you're providing the fundamental building blocks, but you're doing them in a very open and extensible way. So it's not a wizard. It's building the individual components and allowing smart people, again, assuming everybody out there is smarter than you, not dumber than you kind of thing, allowing the people who are smarter than you out there to assemble these fundamental building blocks and build things. So Actions is a great example, because Actions is an automation platform and allows you to automate stuff that happens in your repo. So people use it for CI and CD, obviously, but they also use it for create an issue if you want a new SharePoint server set up, or create an issue if you want a new deployment out in your cloud environment, and then have automation, which actually does all the automation to create that environment so you don't need admin permissions, and then push that link to that environment back to you. There's all these options for automation, but then how it's built, it's very extensible, because you can go and look at the source code of how somebody wrote an integration. You can go look at that and then go build your own and go and extend it and integrate it and then just plug it in. So every action in GitHub is just a pointer to a repo where that source code is stored that shows what it does for the action. And so you just get a network effect. You get this this massive system that just kind of amplifies each other, and just that's how you get exponential growth, is by having these network effects.
I know in 2018, that's when Microsoft acquired GitHub, and 2 years prior to that, we acquired Xamarin. And if you use these as examples of Microsoft supporting, or at least moving towards the notion of open source development, the goal has always been for GitHub to accelerate the world's ability to share. And I know with Microsoft, there is certainly a goal of wanting to do that for the enterprise. This may be a short answer. It may be a longer answer. You gave me one sample example that led me into think about if we're getting more GitHubby, what has happened after the acquisition? Has it changed the product direction, the platform direction, the mindset, anything? Where would you put us, now a couple of years later?
Talking to the community, I think even the die-hard people who were like, the world is going to end kind of predictions pre-acquisition have been pleasantly surprised with the increase in velocity of features that are coming out of GitHub. And because Microsoft's wants to invest in it, we want to build a platform that's the home for all developers. Microsoft, want that to happen for lots of reasons. One is because they use GitHub to build all the products of Microsoft, so they need GitHub to be as awesome as possible, and they don't want to get locked out. So that in itself justifies a lot of the investment in GitHub.
I think that's called eating your own dog food, and now really eating your own dog food.
Yeah, but when you're a company of scale of Microsoft, you want to make sure that your fundamental platforms you have control over, and you can make sure get the investment they need in the right places. So for that makes a ton of sense. But then also, it's Microsoft are obviously, the perception changes amongst developers and amongst system maintainers of what Microsoft can actually do for them, which helps Microsoft do that. But on the GitHub side, it's just, access to more resources, access to IP, things like code spaces, which is a feature where you can stand up a cloud space development environment, action, like some of the Actions infrastructure. It's just accelerated a lot of the plans that GitHub already had. And now that they've got these resources and this investment, announcement, they can go do things like make GitHub free for everybody, which it never was before. Now GitHub's free for both public and private projects. In the past, like prior to Microsoft acquisition, that just wasn't possible from a purely financial point of view. So I think everybody's been pleased with the increase in velocity and features, and we're definitely investing a lot more in engineering and all that sort of stuff. And hopefully, people don't think like the community's broken or anything like that. Like, it's still very open source, still very GitHub-y. Those things, like the worst doom predictions there, haven't come to pass. That's for sure.
I think we will have a lot of people in our audience that are developers, so don't dumb this down just for me, but I'll be frank. I know that there are some out there that aren't developers like myself, but they know the notion of sharing. From a SharePoint community perspective, they've got a tagline: sharing is caring. And they really mean it, from code and best practices and all of that. But from a platform perspective, how do you position GitHub as a great place to share code, knowledge, whatever, but land on maybe a couple of features that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, probably what we would is, like, most people who know GitHub from like the open source side and like consuming of open source components that are hosted on GitHub. But if we talk like end to end of what you do in your job when you're building stuff and deploying stuff. So on GitHub, you have the planning capabilities, and we just announced a whole bunch of improvements there. So being able to track issues, being able to manage backlogs of work, manage like Kanban boards and move work items around and do all that sort of stuff. So starting off there with planning of work and working with your stakeholders on a single source of truth of where we are and what we've got to do. Bit like SharePoint lists, but not, but that kind of thing.
I think that's my favorite statement so far, besides GitHub-y.
Yeah, exactly. A bit like, but very not. There's no GUIDs kicking around either. So that's right. So then you've got that side. Then you've got the raw code side. So you think of that as Git. But then the fundamental thing that GitHub added was the notion of pull requests. And a pull request is the ability to do a code review. It's where you take you've got a copy of the code somewhere else, and you say, hey, I would like you to pull this into your repository, please. I'm sending you a request to pull it in. Let's do a code review of it. And that's where you do a lot of collaboration over a code change. So issues is the discussion, is the work, tracking of work. Actually, even before issues is discussions. And then that's new functionality that's landed, since acquisition. And discussions is conversations. It's either Q&A, a bit like Stack Overflow, or it's open-ended discussions. It's where you figure out what it is you want to go build. Issues is where you track the work. Once you've decided what you want to go build, it's building it. Code, where you go build it. Pull requests, how you collaborate on the code, how you make sure you verify changes. And then actions gives you the ability to do a bunch of automation, typically around CI/CD. You can do verification checks, all that sort of stuff, so CI check, make sure things happen. You can do CD, you can deploy to different environments, production, development, whatever. You can have all those. You can have approvals when you go from dev to prod and all that sort of stuff. And then and then you go to a release, you create a release, which is the thing you download from, or the thing that triggers a deployment into prod, or however you want to set that up. And then you loop. So it's that kind of that whole dev process, and there's features along the way that help you do that as you go through. That's probably the best way.
Yeah, you said it early on around collaboration, and all of that resonated with how a developer would want to collaborate. And I think that notion of having to be open in the context of being able to almost like matchmake with somebody else or a broader set of somebody else's that are truly interested in what you're doing, or just very interested in making sure you're headed in the right direction. It's really cool.
An organization as well. So, open source, you can see how that works. You have, public people, and then you have the people who are working on it. But inside an organization, it often works this way as well, where you have the 5 or 6 or, 2 or 3 people that are actually the maintainers of that part of code that have the right access to the code. And then you have the hundreds of people inside the organization that are stakeholders that are interested in what this thing does. So you get these communities that form inside organizations as well. And if you can try and think of the way you build things inside your company as smaller, as inside the firewall communities, and then you have public communities versus, company-wide communities, then it helps you sort of think about software development a little bit differently and understand how like this more social way of coding, this more collaborative way of coding, it could actually work for you as a business, not just, when you're building open source and sharing.
Can you share one recent or just significant example of a really good contribution or a repository or a commit? One good example to paint a picture of what they're contributing, how they're operating within GitHub, just something that gives a sense of that good contribution and best practices around it.
One I saw this morning actually there's a repository called PyWheels, which manages like Python packages for the Raspberry Pi. They're an open source project, but they have a system that's managing their packages. They're wanting to capture data from their community about improvements. We added a feature on GitHub, which was to do with issue forms. So that's basically creating a form for data to get filled into when you create an issue. They added a button into their website so that if you wanted to report a problem, it would go over to issue forms and pre-populate it with some data into that form so that then, just in the query string, that helped them get better data from their community about what improvements they wanted to make. But where they made that change was actually in the source code of the thing that they're making changes to, if you like, because they made the changes there. So everybody has access to that code. Everybody sees how it works, but it's helping them make their software better and helping them serve their community better by making use of some of these fundamental building blocks we've provided them. And you get the network effect all over again, because you're getting you get this kind of just acceleration of little improvements that people can build on and get better. And then you build more levels of complexity out. So there's an example. Another one I saw recently was around actions, and somebody created an action that does great release notes and allows you to create a template for your release notes. And that was perfect for me. I was able to use that for my own projects, so that when I go to create a release, it's automatically built the release notes for me based on what changes have been made already in my source code base with links back to work items and things. So I've got the end-to-end traceability. That's a feature we were hoping to build at some point. Somebody's gone and created an action in the community and built it. So we don't, the community can just use that. They don't need to wait on us to go build that functionality for them. So again, that was another great extension I saw recently.
That I think is even an additive, strong example of how broad GitHub, really reaches to excite that community in the same context of, exciting the enterprise community. They may be one and the same as far as the developers, but for the use cases and scenarios and maybe the work versus life and fun versus, contributing to the organization. That's a great balance.
And getting the cross-pollination of ideas as well. Like I was literally talking to the Raspberry Pi Foundation this morning, and then I'm talking to a bank the moment, like straight afterwards, and so having this cross-pollination of ideas between these different communities as well just helps us as an industry get so much better, because again, we're learning from everybody, not just from the people in our little niche. And so we get much more diverse views. And as we all know, the healthiest ecosystems in nature are the most diverse ecosystems. So by doing this with software development, we just get to cross-pollinate all these ideas from everybody. So it's fantastic.
I want to give a quick shout out to a couple of our community members that I know are very active in GitHub. And then off of that, just wanted to get your take on a little bit more narrow view on the SharePoint and Microsoft 365 community. But later in this episode, we're going to be talking to Tetsuya Kawahara from Japan and his contributions and use. But I also wanted to highlight a few others that I just have seen and have actually have leveraged one of their examples. But João Ferreira from Portugal and Chris Kent from the US, they're very much contributors around SharePoint lists, and a lot of the best practices around just using SharePoint from an extension platform perspective. What is your perspective on what you see that community contributing into GitHub, from whatever depth that you're aware of it?
Yeah, so you see a few different things. Like you see a lot more sharing happening, but then that's fundamentally driving a difference in the architecture as well, how it's getting more component based. The SharePoint environment in particular, and but also things like Dynamics and stuff, it was harder to do CD type workloads in those environments because of all the configuration and all those sorts of things. And so we're getting more mature at doing that now. And so as we build our maturity in that space, because it's a combination of configuration and setup and population of data as well as these components, you know what I mean? And so I'm seeing a lot more maturity building up there, and that's big coming from the community. You know, that is, the community is showing us how to do the best practices of CI/CD with SharePoint components while not messing up the content that's part of it. And then that encourages Microsoft to kind of separate out the platform a bit more as well. So yeah, the community have been driving a lot of this innovation, and it's been really cool to see a lot of those CD best practices start to come about.
That's great. I can imagine your backlog, is full and rich and healthy. And I think that you've been learning and building GitHub. Before you joined GitHub, you've been articulating what is Microsoft going to do on GitHub and now with GitHub. And just to know that you're supporting that many communities, that many voices, and obviously anything that we and you and your team put into it, I'm sure we get back tenfold in a most positive way. It's been great chatting with you to hear more about your, journey into GitHub, but also your support of the community, which we're always big fans of, with SharePoint community being really, I think, the reason that the SharePoint product is what it is today. And a lot that from hearing from you in terms of how the contributors are contributing. And I know that our engineers are very active in listening. If people want to learn more about what you and your team are doing, where should they go?
Yeah, best place to go is just github.com/home, actually, in case you're logged in already. So that'll take you to an overview of what's there. And then if you follow @GitHub on Twitter, that's the best way of keeping up to date with what's happening in terms of new releases and new functionality. A lot of people know GitHub just from some of the open source sharing side. And so if you follow along with, say, that Twitter feed or youtube.com/GitHub as well, you'll learn a lot more about some of the other feature sets and functionality and kind of understand how GitHub works in an enterprise environment. Like it's in 72% of the Fortune 50, you know what I mean? It's used heavily in the enterprise. So you won't just think of it as the open source sharing, but how you can use these features and functionality in the enterprise setting as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time. If you have any last words for developers, love to hear it, but certainly want to appreciate everything that you've been sharing today.
We're building on the shoulders of giants, and pay that forwards. So if there are things you can do to share, this is the SharePoint community is great at sharing. But if don't think that you need to be an expert to share what you're doing. Sharing your journey as you learn is probably more valuable than sharing the journey once you're already an expert and you've forgotten the pain of getting there. So share what you can, share components, share your journey of learning, and that will help the people around you and allow you to pay it forward from the people that you've learned from.
Mark, that was really great. Thank you for sharing that interview with us, with me. I kind of forget all of the powers and superpowers that GitHub has. I use a very tiny piece of it for my work, and it's just a great reminder of the value of the community and what we've been able to do there. That's why I'm even more excited to hear from Tetsuya, not just from a perspective of what does GitHub do, but what have people done with GitHub and the value there. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that.
So now we are very excited to have from a very distance, from a location perspective in Japan, but close at heart because he's a part of the SharePoint community and, of course, the list community. And I wanted to introduce and welcome Tetsuya to the Intrazone. Tetsuya, welcome.
こんにちは. Hello.
The first thing that we would like to ask is, can you tell us about yourself, how you became a Microsoft MVP, and your experience in the broader tech community?
はい、先ほども申し上げました通り、私の名前は川原哲也と申します。
First of all, my name is Tetsuya Kawahara. I live in Toyama Prefecture in Japan. I work for a company that manufactures automobile parts, and as such, I develop an internal system for the factories and also provide operational support for Microsoft 365 or SharePoint.
すみません。マイクロソフト MVP を受賞
With regards to how I became a Microsoft MVP, I published on GitHub various samples of list formatting that uses JSON to change the appearance of Microsoft lists. And I was given the MVP award for that work that I did.
Congratulations. Becoming an MVP is a big honor, I think, on the outside world, but it's also a big honor for us at Microsoft to be working with you as well.
ありがとうございます。
You're very welcome. And I understand that there's also a video that you have that shows a really great example of lists, and we will make sure to put that into the show notes.
ありがとうございます。
So before we get into the technology and to GitHub, it would be great to hear more about the west coast of the mainland, just to understand what it's like. And if you're interested in people wanting to learn more about the industry in the region, to understand, is it a really large technology community? And if not, how do you connect with the broader tech community from Japan across the world?
はい。まず、私の住んでいる富山県についてお話しさせていただきたいと思います。
Well, first of all, I will start with talking about the prefecture that I live in, which is Toyama Prefecture. Toyama Prefecture is located in the northern part of central Japan, facing the Sea of Japan. It has a very strong and thriving fishing industry and has a population of about 1 million. Toyama Prefecture is known for its fresh seafood such as yellowtail, firefly squid, and Japanese glass shrimp. Yellowtail is exceptionally good in wintertime, and people from all over the country come to Toyama to taste it.
続いて、富山の有名な観光地についてご紹介するのですが、
Next, I'd like to talk about Toyama's famous tourist spots that include Tateyama Kurobe Alpine Route. The Tateyama Kurobe Alpine Route is a spectacular mountain scenic route featuring the majestic mountains that are almost 10,000 feet in elevation. It offers magnificent views of natural landscapes in every season. I should also mention one place called Snow Corridor, where people can go through, and the snow walls on both sides are like 40 to 60 feet high.
で、続いて私のコミュニティについて
Now I'd like to touch upon the tech communities in Toyama. In Toyama Prefecture, where I live, to my knowledge, there are no tech communities for SharePoint or M365. However, in Japan as a whole, there are some M365 related communities.
私自身は、そういったコミュニティの方
I typically use Twitter to connect with those community members.
If you could tell us a little bit about the first time that you committed something into GitHub, what was the project and what was your intent of sharing the code and the design?
初めて GitHub にコミットしたのは、実は、このリストの
In fact, the first project I committed to GitHub was this sample collection of list formatting. And the reason I committed my project to GitHub was actually when I published list formatting samples that I try to make for myself on Twitter. Chris Kent of PNP core team suggested and invited me to publish them to the sample collection of GitHub. That was the first commit to GitHub that I made. The very first sample that I committed to GitHub was a formatting that turns a list into a graphical timeline.
So we know Chris Kent very well, and we know his powers with lists, and we're really grateful that he brought you in based on what he saw, what you were doing with lists.
私もクリス・ケントさん尊敬していて、もう先生と呼んでいます。
I have a lot of respect for Chris Kent, and I call him my sensei. Sensei meaning teacher.
I can imagine that because he would be a great sensei. We will have links to a lot of your samples just to let everybody know I benefit from what you've put out on Twitter because I also have used some of your samples in the lists that I use here at Microsoft.
めちゃくちゃ嬉しいです。ありがとうございます。
I am extremely happy to hear that.
When did you start working with lists?
There was a groupware migration project that we were working on at my company, which led me to start using SharePoint and lists. My first experience was with SharePoint Server 2013, and I remember that it was very difficult. First of all, when I tried to create a site, there were too many site templates to choose from, and I had no idea which one to use. After the site was created, I wanted to add an application, but again, there were too many of them, and I didn't know which one to add. It was kind of overwhelming, and I felt like I had a lot of difficulty and felt kind of lost. In addition, I was also using SharePoint Designer to create workflow and edit the master page, which was extremely difficult for me. More importantly, when I went online to find more information about SharePoint in Japanese, I had a hard time finding what I was looking for.
I can imagine just hearing you say editing a master page immediately reminds me that that was difficult, and learning to get beyond that would have been an early challenge getting used to SharePoint. You know, once you got used to working with SharePoint and you started working with SharePoint lists, can you explain one or two of the early use cases or a scenario when you started using SharePoint lists?
In the beginning, no one in our team knew much about SharePoint, so we used SharePoint lists to make a SharePoint tip sheet that can be used by everyone in the team. If we find any information about SharePoint, we would put it registered in the tip sheet so that the information can be shared by the entire team members. We also use SharePoint lists to make lists of devices and equipment and even office supplies in the company, as well as a collection of links to information sites that we used.
Just from knowing a lot of what you've put out there that I've seen as your JSON samples in the GitHub for PNP, how do you decide what samples you create and share?
普段、自分自身でSharePoint リストを
As I use SharePoint lists a lot in my daily life, I often think to myself, wouldn't it be useful or fun to have this kind of formatting or that kind of formatting? And that's how I decide to make a sample. Also, when I see someone tweeting and says, oh, I wish I could do this with the lists, then I try to create a sample too.
That is a very kind way to work with the community, and I would say that Sensei Kent has taught you very well. So I know that you've created a lot of samples, and it sounds like you've responded to a lot of people's Twitter requests or hopes and dreams. Do you have a favorite project that you've contributed to the community?
基本的には全てお気に入りなのですが、中でも
Well, basically, I love all of them, but my favorite of all is the formatting that turns a list into a link collection with emoji. I like it because when you apply that, the display becomes larger and the emoji themselves would make it visually easier to understand. And most importantly, the pictograms or emoji are very cute.
It really takes a row and columns and makes it look very beautiful and very, filled with, I think, emojis and cartoons.
ありがとうございます。
You must come across a lot of different samples that other people provide into GitHub. Do you have a favorite project that another person in the community has committed to GitHub?
はい。ちょっとお名前の発音間違ってるかも
I
しれない
like the formatting created by, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right, but his name is Joao Ferreira, and this is one that enlarges the image in the image column using mouse hover. That's my favorite. It is very convenient because you can use mouse hover to easily check the enlarged image. It's very convenient and very nice, I thought.
I will have to find that one because I keep a list of upcoming list features that we work on the roadmap, and it would be nice to be able to do a quick view of what the feature looks like in the early stages. I wanted to ask a question about GitHub specifically. From a features perspective, what do you find that you use the most within GitHub?
I
often use pull requests to publish formatting samples to GitHub.
For people that don't know what a pull request is, can you explain a little bit more what it is and how it works?
Pull
request is a feature you can use to let other developers know about the code you wrote or modified so that they can review it. For example, when you want to change the source code stored in GitHub, you really can't make the change on the fly by yourself. You need to go through a source code reviewer who will then apply the change. So when you want to change the source code in GitHub, you will first use a pull request to have the change reviewed.
Yeah, that helps to understand a lot because now I can picture the contribution of code and the use of code or the reuse of code as being very collaborative.
Yes, I often have my sensei, Chris Kent, to review my codes.
Now I can see that you both work really well together. Tetsuya, it has been a pleasure talking to you. We want to make sure that everybody can find a lot of your list formatting samples, but also just to be able to see what you're doing. What would you say is the best place where you would point people to learn about your samples and follow what you're doing?
私も今日お話できてとても良かったです。
It was my pleasure to speak with you, Mark, and I am often on Twitter, so please follow me on Twitter. I would love that.
We will make sure that we get a lot more followers following you because I will tell everybody listening it is very worth it.
ぜひお願いします。
Very welcome. Well, I just want to say, Tetsuya, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you on the Interzone. And more than the Interzone, thank you for being a part of the broader community.
はい。私も今日本当にお話できてとても嬉しいです。ありがとうございました。
I would like to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you, and it's been a pleasure.
So up next on the Interzone, it's time for events. As we've been watching throughout the second half of 2021, we're starting to see our event calendar fill up. And one event going on right now, this week, is the North American Collaboration Summit. This is a hybrid event. It is being held in Branson, Missouri, and it'll be wrapping up tomorrow.
Our next event is actually just a session, but it's an event as a part of the Adelaide Australian user group. Chris and I are going to be joining their meetup, and we've got a session that's titled SharePoint, Teams, Lists, Viva, the Interzone. Oh my! But it's a fun one. We're really looking forward to joining in online to get everybody up to speed on SharePoint through the lens of some of the new applications that we're working on, like Microsoft Lists and Microsoft Viva, and really land what their role is in Microsoft Teams. Plus, we've got a fun interview segment with 3 of the local community members to talk about solution architecture and the modern workplace. So if you're interested to plug in like we are from afar, or if you're in Adelaide, join locally, join in on this meetup. We'll have a link in the show notes so you can jump in.
As we get into September, Commsverse, with an S in the middle there, Sverse. September 15th to 16th. This is a Teams community event. It is being hosted from the United Kingdom. It is hybrid. So there's an online component as well as some additional in-person presentations that you can plug into as part of that event. And we'll have the details in the show notes.
Next is the SharePoint Fest DC. They just wrapped up SharePoint Fest Chicago. And the difference at the DC event is they will have a dedicated Teams Fest track in addition to all the SharePoint goodness. This is September 20th to the 24th, and it is in person, intended to be a regional, local community offering. And there's a lot planned in terms of if you're specific to interest around what we offer from a government perspective. That's our government cloud and certainly best practices for how anybody in the public sector can engage with technology. So great event. And the SharePoint Fest team always puts on really nice regional experiences. So if you're in the DC area, SharePoint Fest DC, September 20th through the 24th.
At the end of September, wrapping into October, Microsoft is taking a fairly big presence this year at the HR Tech Conference 2021. That's happening September 28th through October 1st at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas. So if you're there, please come by our booth and check it out. I haven't been able to say that in about a year and a half.
I'm excited for what the team is doing there, not only to highlight, and amplify a lot of the progress around products like Viva, Microsoft Teams, what we're doing, across the spectrum of Microsoft 365. But I also know from an HR perspective, really putting it through that unique lens of how do human resources across the world benefit from technology in what we're doing and what other companies are doing. There's a lot of non-Microsoft offerings that will be there. I think we will also learn from. In the event space, we want to round out with one last item that we've been talking about for a little bit, which is a now on-demand available workshop for Microsoft Lists. This is if you're just getting started with List or thinking about rolling out lists for yourself on behalf of your company. There's some great information so that you can learn what lists are and how to use it, but also some training material that you can use to deliver the workshop in your own organization. So we'll have a link in the show notes for all of these events, including the workshop, so that you can go and learn more, but also get those materials that I talked about if you want to share more about lists in your organization.
We know there are more events coming up after this. So if you have an event that you'd like us to promote on a future episode of the IntroZone, please write to us and we'll be happy to give you the spotlight. Well, that is a wrap. We'd like to thank Martin Woodward and Tetsuya Kawahara for their insights into GitHub, collaboration, and our great ecosystem of developers across the community. We'll put links to everything they talked about today and more in the show notes and, of course, on the IntroZone blog.
You can check out our show page at aka.ms/theinterzone and find an episode, this one or in the past, that you've missed. Check it out, listen to an episode, and don't forget, subscribe.
And if you're curious about other Microsoft shows after you've finished all of the IntroZone backlog, then and only then, we'd encourage you to go to aka.ms/Microsoft/podcasts, and you'll be able to discover a new program from one of our colleagues.
If you have a question, if you have any feedback or anything related to what we've talked about, you can always email us at theinterzone@microsoft.com or seek us out on Twitter, either via @SharePoint, @mcashman, and @cmcnulty2000.
Word of mouth is still the best way people learn about podcasts. So if you enjoyed this show, help us reach more people. Share the SharePoint love and follow the show at your local NFL training camp or wherever you get your podcasts.
We are your hosts, one that can actually call the touchdown in the appropriate fashion and one that might fumble it a little bit by the way that he talks about football. That's how it goes around here on the IntroZone, a show about the Microsoft 365 GitHubby intelligent intranet. And I want to throw in a reminder to stick around if you want to hear Tetsuya answer in his native Japanese language in his entirety. So stick around. Thanks for joining the IntroZone. So now we are very excited to have from a very distance, from a location perspective in Japan, but close at heart because he's a part of the SharePoint community and, of course, the list community. And I wanted to introduce and welcome Tetsuya to the IntroZone. Tetsuya, welcome.
こんにちは. Hello.
The first thing that we would like to ask is, can you tell us about yourself, how you became a Microsoft MVP, and your experience in the broader tech community?
はい、先ほども申し上げました通り、私の名前は川原哲也と申します。今、日本の富山県というところに住んでおります。 仕事の方は、自動車の部品を作る工場で働いておりまして、その工場内の社内システムの開発だったり、マイクロソフト365だったり、シェアポイントなどの、グループやシステムの運用サポートなどをしております。すいません。マイクロソフト MVP を受賞させていただいた経緯なんですが、リストの書式設定、リストフォーマッティングと呼ばれる、マイクロソフトリストの見た目を、JSON を使って変える技術があるのですが、そちらのサンプルを GitHub にいろいろと公開していたところ、受賞させていただくという形になりました。
Congratulations. Becoming an MVP is a big honor, I think, on the outside world, but it's also a big honor for us at Microsoft to be working with you as well.
ありがとうございます。
You're very welcome. And I understand that there's also a video that you have that shows a really great example of lists, and we will make sure to put that into the show notes.
ありがとうございます。
So before we get into the technology and to GitHub, it would be great to hear more about the west coast of the mainland, just to understand what it's like. And if you're interested in people wanting to learn more about the industry in the region, to understand, is it a really large technology community? And if not, how do you connect with the broader tech community from Japan across the world?
はい。まず、私の住んでいる富山県についてお話しさせていただきたいと思います。富山県は中部地方の北部に位置しており、日本海に面している場所にあります。人口は約100万人で、漁業が盛んな地域になっております。富山県の有名な食べ物としては、寒ブリやホタルイカ、白エビなどがあります。特に、寒ブリはとっても美味しくて、日本全国から、たくさんの人が食べに来ます。続いて、富山の有名な観光地についてご紹介するのですが、富山の有名な観光地としては、立山黒部アルペンルートは、標高3000メートル級のいくつもの山が連なった、山岳観光ルートになっていまして、四季折々の雄大な大自然を、見ることができます。で、中でも、雪の大谷と呼ばれる、巨大な雪の壁の中を歩ける場所があるのですが、そこが人気の観光スポットになっています。で、続いて私の、コミュニティについてご紹介させていただきたいと思うのですが、私の住んでいる富山県では、シェアポイントだったり、そのマイクロソフト365に関する技術コミュニティは、ありません。ただ、日本全体ではマイクロソフト365関連のコミュニティは、いくつかあります。私自身は、そういったコミュニティの方々とは、ツイッターを通して連絡を取り合ったりしています。
If you could tell us a little bit about the first time that you committed something into GitHub, what was the project and what was your intent of sharing the code and the design?
初めて GitHub にコミットしたのは、実は、このリストの書式設定のサンプル集でした。コミットした理由なんですけど、Twitter で自分で作ってみたリストの書式設定を公開してみたところ、PNP コアチームのクリス・ケントさんから、GitHub のサンプル集に公開してみないというお誘いをいただき、その流れで、コミットするようになりました。で、その初めてコミットしたサンプルは、リストをグラフィカルなタイムラインに変身させる、書式設定でした。
So we know Chris Kent very well, and we know his powers with lists, and we're really grateful that he brought you in based on what he saw, what you were doing with lists.
私もクリス・ケントさん尊敬していて、もう先生と呼んでいます。
I can imagine that because he would be a great sensei.We will have links to a lot of your samples just to let everybody know I benefit from what you've put out on Twitter because I also have used some of your samples in the lists that I use here at Microsoft.
めちゃくちゃ嬉しいです。ありがとうございます。
When did you start working with lists?
会社でグループウェアの移行プロジェクトがあって、それをきっかけにシェアポイントと、リストを使い始めました。初めて触ったのが、シェアポイントサーバー2013だったのですが、とっても難しかった記憶があります。まずサイトを作ろうとしても、サイトのテンプレートが多すぎて、どれを使えばいいかわからず、そのサイトを作った後もアプリを追加しようとしてもアプリ アプリの種類もたくさんあってどれを追加すればわからず、とにかくわからないことだらけで難しかった気がします。あと、シェアポイントデザイナーで、ワークフローの作成だったり、マスターページの編集だったりもしていたのですが、それはもう本当に難しかったです。あと、また、日本語でシェアポイントのことを検索しても、なかなか目的のものが見つけられず、それが一番苦労しました。
I can imagine just hearing you say editing a master page immediately reminds me that that was difficult, and learning to get beyond that would have been an early challenge getting used to SharePoint. You know, once you got used to working with SharePoint and you started working with SharePoint lists, can you explain one or two of the early use cases or a scenario when you started using SharePoint lists?
シェアポイントを使い始めの頃は、シェアポイントのことをチーム全体で、誰もわからなかったということもあって、シェアポイントリストを使ってシェアポイントのチップス集みたいなものを、チーム内で作って、運用していました。で、シェアポイントのことについて、少しでも調べたら、そのリストに調べた内容を登録して、チーム全体で共有するようにしていました。あとは、社内の備品一覧リストだったり、情報サイトへのリンク集などを、シェアポイントリストを使って、作っていました。
Just from knowing a lot of what you've put out there that I've seen as your JSON samples in the GitHub for PNP, how do you decide what samples you create and share?
普段、自分自身でシェアポイントリストを使っている中で、こんな風な書式設定があったら便利かなとか、面白いかなと思いついたら、サンプルを作っています。あとは、ツイッターを見ていて、他の人たちが、リストでこんなことできればいいのにというツイートを見たりしたら、自分でサンプルを作ってみたりしています。
That is a very kind way to work with the community, and I would say that Sensei Kent has taught you very well. So I know that you've created a lot of samples, and it sounds like you've responded to a lot of people's Twitter requests or hopes and dreams. Do you have a favorite project that you've contributed to the community?
基本的には全てお気に入りなのですが、中でもお気に入りなのは、リストを、絵文字付きのリンク集に変身させる書式設定のサンプルです。その書式設定を適用すると、絵文字が大きく表示されるのですが、そうすると、視覚的にリンクがわかりやすくなって、何より絵文字が可愛いので、お気に入りです。
It really takes a row and columns and makes it look very beautiful and very, filled with, I think, emojis and cartoons.
ありがとうございます。
You must come across a lot of different samples that other people provide into GitHub. Do you have a favorite project that another person in the community has committed to GitHub?
はい。ちょっとお名前の発音間違ってるかもしれないんですが、ジョー・フェレリアさん。はい。が作られた、イメージ列の画像を、マウスホバーで、拡大表示する書式設定が、お気に入りです。マウスホバーで、簡単に拡大された画像を確認できるので、すごく便利でナイスアイディアだと思いました。
I will have to find that one because I keep a list of upcoming list features that we work on the roadmap, and it would be nice to be able to do a quick view of what the feature looks like in the early stages. I wanted to ask a question about GitHub specifically. From a features perspective, what do you find that you use the most within GitHub?
私はその書式設定のサンプルをよく GitHub に公開するのですが、その時にプルリクエストという機能をよく使います。
For people that don't know what a pull request is, can you explain a little bit more what it is and how it works?
プルリクエストとは、自分が作ったコードや修正したコードを、他の開発者に知らせて、レビューしてもらうといった機能になります。GitHub にあるソースコードを変更する際、いきなり自分自身で変更できるわけではなく、一度レビュアーと呼ばれるソースコードをレビューする人を通して、その変更が適用されることになります。 なので、GitHub のソースコードを変更したい場合は、まずプルリクエストをしてレビューしてもらうという流れになります。
Yeah, that helps to understand a lot because now I can picture the contribution of code and the use of code or the reuse of code as being very collaborative.
はい。私も先生のクリス・ケントさんによくコードを見てもらってます。
Now I can see that you both work really well together. Setsuyo, it has been a pleasure talking to you. We want to make sure that everybody can find a lot of your list formatting samples, but also just to be able to see what you're doing. What would you say is the best place where you would point people to learn about your samples and follow what you're doing?
はい、私も今日お話できてとても良かったです。私はよくツイッターを利用しているので、ツイッターのフォローをしていただければと思います。
We will make sure that we get a lot more followers following you because I will tell everybody listening it is very worth it.
ぜひお願いします。
Very welcome. Well, I just want to say, Tetsuya, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you on the Intrazone. And more than the Intrazone, thank you for being a part of the broader community.
はい。私も今日本当にお話できてとても嬉しいです。ありがとうございました。